It is impossible, for me at least, to imagine a course on money, banking, and financial markets that did not honor the contributions that Milton Friedman made to economics in general and our understanding of monetary policy in particular. Friedman was born in 1912 and died in 2006, and spent the great majority of his professional career as a professor at the University of Chicago and a fellow at the Hoover Institute. Friedman made many contributions to economic theory, including his work on consumption in the United States, which the Nobel Committee cited when it awarded him the prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel in 1976. While he contributed many important ideas to economics and political economics, Friedman is best known, among economists at least, for his contributions to monetary theory and his views on monetary policy. Milton Friedman had much to say about monetary policies and about the dangers of ill-conceived monetary policies. In his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1968, Friedman cautioned that there are limitations to what monetary policy can do. In particular, he cautioned that monetary policy, and I quote, cannot peg interest rates for more than very limited periods, and cannot peg the rate of unemployment for more than very limited periods, end quote. Friedman highlighted these two limitations because he thought that politicians, economists, and people generally believe that monetary policy has far greater power to affect economic outcomes than Friedman believed they did. What could monetary policy do? Friedman writes, the first and most important lesson that history teaches about what monetary policy can do, and it is a lesson of the most profound importance, is that monetary policy can prevent money itself from being a major source of economic disturbance, end quote. So, Milton Friedman tells us that central bank authorities should sign on to the Hippocratic Oath and promise to first do no harm. Friedman continues, and again I quote, the Great Contraction might not have occurred at all, and if it had, it would have been far less severe if the monetary authority had avoided mistakes, end quote. Now, by the Great Contraction, Milton Friedman means the Great Depression of 1931 to 39. And Friedman believes that Fed policy during the Great Depression actually made things worse rather than better. Finally, Friedman acknowledges that the Fed can do more than simply avoiding harmful actions. He concludes, and I quote yet again, the second thing monetary policy can do is provide a stable background for the economy, keep the machine well-oiled. Our economic system will work best when producers and consumers, employers and employees, can proceed with full confidence that the average level of prices will behave in a known way in the future. Preferably that it will be highly stable, end quote. So why do I think it's important to remember Milton Friedman? It's true that Friedman is part of the economics pantheon, but that's not the reason. It is Friedman's ideas that command our attention, especially the warning that monetary policy, when badly done, can worsen economic conditions. We live in a world where expectations are great and blame comes quickly when things go wrong. In this world, individuals with public platforms sometimes use those platforms to blame the Federal Reserve when it acts and when it does not act. It is thus important to remember what Milton Friedman had to say about the limits of monetary policy. This is the first of 2 lectures devoted to the question, what should a central bank do? In today's lecture, I will ask what the objective or objectives of monetary policy should be. In the following lecture, I will ask whether central banks should follow rules of behavior or whether they should routinely use discretion in the conduct of monetary policy. It's important to understand why Friedman believed that a central bank cannot affect the employment of resources in the long run. Remember, he said cannot peg the unemployment rate except for a limited amount of time. A simple example explains the essence of the argument that changes in the money supply and therefore changes in monetary policy cannot affect employment of resources in the long run. So I have a story for you. Suppose there is an economy that began in equilibrium with its resources fully employed. What does this mean? Well, among other things, this means that wage rates were at levels so that qualified workers who wanted a job either had one or could find one in a short amount of time. It also means that managers of factories were operating their factories at levels that they believed that they could sustain indefinitely and that they would want to sustain indefinitely. That is, managers were able to service and repair their equipment, and workers were content to work the hours necessary to keep those factories humming again and again, day after day, month after month. Now suppose that the central bank doubled the money supply. I mean that the central bank literally created $2 or 2 euros or 2 Swiss francs or 2 yen for every $1 previously in existence. I mention those other currencies because the story is not unique to the United States. For the sake of argument, suppose that the central bank accomplished this goal by trading 2 new dollars for 1 old dollar. Right? So everybody had to turn in their old dollars, but they got 2 new dollars for every old dollar they turned in. Friedman would sometimes describe this thought experiment as a helicopter drop of money onto the economy. If everyone understood what the central bank had done, and I know this is a big if, then there would be a new equilibrium with several characteristics. First, production and employment, and it follows that consumption and investment, would all be exactly the same as they were before. But the price of every good and service in this new equilibrium would be exactly twice as many dollars as before. Wait a minute. The result would be, on net, the same as if we had redefined our unit of account to be the 50-cent piece. Well, that may be true in the long run, but in the short run, an increase in the money supply clearly has real effects. I mean effects on employment, consumption, investment, and so forth. Providers of goods and services, including labor services, will not raise their prices immediately. Remember, in the long run, wages would have to double too under our first experiment. But in the short run, if that's going to happen slowly. The central bank will increase the money supply by increasing federal funds to banks, and the result will be that interest rates will fall. Well, those whose spending decisions are sensitive to interest rates, like those who have to borrow to buy a new car, will spend more in response, and employment of resources will increase. If people buy more autos, we have to employ more auto workers or have our auto workers work overtime. Now, this may occur even if the economy is already operating at or near full employment, since workers and firms may choose to work overtime for a while, taking advantage of this opportunity. So, the increase in the money supply will lead in the short run to higher levels of output and employment. Very different short run and long run effects. Now, let me consider a variation of my experiment, which is more to the point of what we consider when we imagine how Federal Reserve or other central banks behave. So suppose now that the Fed or some other central bank raised the rate at which it expanded the supply of money. That is, the Fed increased the money supply not once, but month after month after month. So perhaps before it was raising the money supply at a rate of 4% per month, and now it raised the money supply at the rate of 6% per month. Understand the difference. Before I was talking about a one-time increase in the quantity of money, and now I'm talking about a systematic month after month increase in the rate of money growth. What did Milton Friedman say about this new experiment? He argued that after the short-run effects of this increased growth in the money supply wore off, after everybody figured out what was going on and adjusted their behavior, the economy would be left with one and only one difference: higher inflation. That inflation would begin in markets where resources were very scarce, but would gradually spread to all markets. As economic decision makers observe the increased rate of inflation, they'd begin building it in to their forecasts for the future. The final outcome would be higher inflation and a return to the economy's normal levels of output and production. Economists have a term for the results of the thought experiments that we have just described. Economists say that the experiments demonstrate the neutrality of money. That is, under the condition of our thought experiments, increasing the supply of money or its growth rate is not like stepping on the gas. It's not like stepping on the brake. It's like leaving the car in neutral. Guided by the understanding that money is neutral in the long run, and guided by Friedman's warning that monetary policy badly done can be destabilizing, some nations commit their central banks to one and only one objective: low and steady inflation. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand has a single mandate: the maintenance of price stability. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act of 1989 specifies that the primary function of the Reserve Bank shall be to deliver, quote, stability in the general level of prices. New Zealand's not alone. The Bank of Japan also has the single mandate of price stability. Quote, the Bank of Japan, as the central bank of Japan, decides and implements monetary policy with the aim of maintaining price stability, end quote. That's from their charter as represented on the website. The website of the People's Bank of China offers a simple statement of its policy objective, quote, the objective of the monetary policy is to maintain the stability of the value of the currency and thereby promote economic growth, end quote. It's not exactly clear what this means. The statement may refer to a stable external value of the yuan, so that the People's Bank of China objective is a stable exchange rate. But the statement may also refer to a stable internal value of the yuan, so that the People's Bank of China objective is stable prices. We're not sure. Other central banks adhere to a dual mandate, in which they require their central banks not only to keep inflation low and stable over the long run, but also to undertake counter-cyclical policy designed to soften the effects of recessions on production and employment. The European Central Bank has a dual mandate, but a dual mandate in which price stability is explicitly stated to be the primary objective. However, the mandate does state that high employment and sustainable growth should be pursued, provided that doing so does not compromise the objective of price stability. The U.S. Congress is generally thought to have provided a dual mandate for the Federal Reserve Bank. Article 2A of the Federal Reserve Act as amended states, and I quote, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Open Market Committee shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates, end quote. While the act I just quoted from mentions three objectives, the objective of, quote, moderate long-term interest rates, end quote, is generally thought to be implied by the other two objectives. That is, an economy where employment is full and prices are stable will be an economy with moderate long-term interest rates. Most analysts believe that during the regimes of Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, and Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee regarded stable prices to be the primary objective of monetary policy, even though the act itself does not say so. Potential disagreement about the mandate of the Fed is engendered by the use of the term, quote, maximum employment, end quote, rather than the alternative term that economists prefer to use, quote, full employment, end quote. Take a moment to explain. Full employment is a concept that talks about employment that could be sustained over the long run. And that typically implies an unemployment rate somewhere between, say, 3.5% and 5%, because there's a natural inflow and outflow of individuals from jobs to new jobs. And those individuals are counted as unemployed when they're making those transitions. So we could get higher employment and lower unemployment rates with draconian measures. We had them, for example, in World War II. But most economists think that that would be suboptimal, and the right language should speak to full employment, not maximal employment. Most economists believe that stimulating the economy to the point where workers will work more in the short run than they would be willing to work in the long run would simply be bad for the economy. The fact that the United States Congress has provided a dual mandate for monetary policy itself creates many opportunities for criticism of the Federal Reserve. In particular, various stakeholders in the U.S. economy argue that the Fed should broaden its objectives. A good example of mandate pressure is the debate that centers on the question of whether or not the Federal Reserve should act to deflate speculative bubbles. In an op-ed piece for the New York Times on June 15, 2008, Alan Blinder of Princeton University addressed the question of what the Fed should do about an asset price bubble like the U.S. experienced between 2004 and 2007. Recall that an asset price bubble is an unsustainable increase in asset prices that occurs over a sustained period of time, months and maybe years rather than days. And of course, the bubble I'm talking about is the housing price bubble, although Blinder would be perfectly happy to think about the dot-com bubble that occurred around the time of the millennium. In this context, unsustainable means that the increase in prices during the bubble is unjustified by changes in underlying fundamental forces. For example, most analysts agree that repeated increases in stock prices are the evidence of a bubble unless they are accompanied by credible evidence that corporate profits will rise. In like manner, a sustained increase in housing prices constitutes a bubble when they are unjustified by fundamentals such as rising rental rates for the same properties that are experiencing rising prices or for comparable properties. Now, Blinder explained that there were two schools of thought as to what the Fed should do when confronted by evidence of a bubble. One view that Blinder explained was shared by Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, and it, quote, holds that deliberate bubble bursting is something between impossible and dangerous and thus best avoided, end quote. According to this view, the Fed should let bubbles burst and then, quote, be prepared to mop up after, end quote. One important point made by this school of thought is that it is very, very difficult to identify the inflation of a bubble in its early stages. The opposite school of thought makes 3 points. First, letting the housing bubble burst on its own led to the subprime mortgage crisis and great economic turmoil. So look what happened. Second, mopping up after a bubble often sows the seeds of the next bubble because during the mopping up operation, the Federal Reserve will keep interest rates abnormally low. And third, allowing bubbles to inflate and then burst leads to more rapid growth in the general level of prices. Prices rise more rapidly during the inflation than they decrease during the bursting phase, so on average we have more inflation. Put another way, inflating bubbles lead to consumer price index inflation because the Fed allows the economy to heat up while the bubble inflates, but then tries to keep it from fully cooling after the bubble bursts. What would Milton Friedman say? Well, Milton Friedman, I believe, would join the Greenspan-Bernanke camp on the question of whether the Fed should try to burst an inflating bubble. I believe that Friedman would warn that it is very difficult to identify a bubble before it bursts, and especially when it first begins to inflate, because analysts rarely agree on the future course of fundamentals. Friedman would likewise warn that by the time the Fed could be reasonably sure that observed increases in asset prices constituted a bubble, by that time, a decision to cool the economy and deflate the bubble would really not begin to affect spending decisions until the bubble was likely to have burst of its own accord. This is very, very important. Friedman would argue that by the time the Fed knew it was facing a bubble and decided to act, the effectiveness of the action that it would take would delay for about 6 to 9 months, as it always does. Lowering the federal funds rate really doesn't affect decisions by spenders for 6 to 9 months. And Friedman is saying, hey, in the next 6 to 9 months after that Fed identification of the bubble, that bubble is likely to have popped. And so the Fed would have acted too late. In fact, Friedman, I believe, would say the Fed would end up perversely reinforcing the recessionary effects of the bubble burst, because its negative policy designed to deflate the bubble would come at the same time of the bubble's own negative effects on economic growth. Alan Blinder's own view is that, provided that the bubbles are not based on excessive bank lending, so that the bubble didn't start with the banking center, the mop-up strategy is a good one. Even when bank lending gets out of hand, Blinder believes that the Fed should not address the problem with such a blunt instrument of interest rate increases, because it has more scalpel-like tools at its disposal that it could use to surgically address the problem. Whatever you believe, Blinder's op-ed piece reminds us that there is no consensus in the United States, let alone in the world, as to what central banks should make the target of monetary policy. Under the U.S. congressional mandate, the Fed has the freedom to deflate a bubble if it believes that doing so would ultimately make the general price level more stable or make the economy less likely to slip into a recession. But remember, and this is important to remember, that Congress has also mandated that the Fed promote maximum employment. Can you for a moment imagine the outrage on Capitol Hill if the Fed began cooling the economy in the early stages of a run-up in stock prices? Think about that for a minute. Today, we have seen that there is, when looking across the nations of the developed world, a good bit of variation in the stated objectives for monetary policy. In the United States, Congress has mandated a two-part goal: maximum employment and price stability, although most economists do believe that the Fed currently considers price stability to be the superior part of the mandate. In contrast, New Zealand has mandated price stability as the single objective of monetary policy. Milton Friedman would much prefer the New Zealand mandate to the one we have. Moreover, Friedman would applaud those central banks, like the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, that take steps to lock themselves into a particular policy. In the next lecture, we will ask whether it's better for the central bank to lock itself in by following a rule, or whether it's better for the central bank to preserve its option to treat every economic situation as a unique one, requiring a unique policy. Thank you.